this computer. Okay. So let's do a quick review from last week. I don't want to take too much time on this, although there's a couple of things that I don't know that I punctuated as much as I'd like to last week. So we've been still looking at the issue of whether the two witnesses are two groups of people or individuals. I probably spent more time on this than we needed to already. I think most Christians do conclude that they are individuals, and I certainly agree with that. But I spent some time on it because there are some popular videos out there that espouse the alternative, that it's a reference to groups of people and that they are not two individuals. And so a couple things that we might want to mention again as we move forward. How would two groups of people bring forth plagues? One of the things the two witnesses are said to do in Revelation chapter 11. In scripture, that's not something we've seen before. It could be completely new, but in the past we've seen the idea of individuals, including Moses and Aaron or Elijah or others, or some of the prophets, bringing forth or prophesying or calling for some kind of calamity or plagues, as is the case of Moses and Aaron. So it's possible that God gives that power to groups of people, but in line with scriptural precedent, again, if we're going to let scripture sort of direct us as best we can to the most reasonable solution, I think, again, I'm not trying to rule something out or force a conclusion on it, but I think we have to weigh the reasonableness, and I think this is one of those cases that kind of points in the direction of individuals. Also, Revelation indicates that the two witnesses will die in the Greek. It says in the broad street of the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified. It doesn't name Jerusalem there. It uses the alternate terms for figuratively the idea of the city being associated with Egypt and Sodom in some respect, and we'll talk more about what that may indicate later. But for John, an eyewitness of Jesus' crucifixion, to state that the two witnesses are killed in the broad street of the city where our Lord was crucified seems hard to dismiss as a reference to Jerusalem, given that John's gospel and others record that Jesus was crucified by the Romans in a location where the Jewish travelers coming into Jerusalem would see him, which is along that main roadway that leads into the city from the east over the Mount of Olives. So that it's hard to explain if this is groups of people. It's harder to explain if these are groups of people, how they all die in that same location, especially if we're talking about worldwide or large groups of people, the church in general, or all Jewish people, something to that effect. We also have to ask, how would we determine which two groups this is talking about, right? Is it Israel and the church? Is it the Jews and the Gentiles? Maybe those are the same thing. What about Judah and Israel, as some have proposed, is mentioned in the Old Testament, or kings and priests? Like, how would we decide which one of those sets it is? I mean, where's that information going to come from? And the other part that I mentioned, I think in passing last week, is that the idea that it would be Judah and Israel is challenged by some passages, including Ezekiel 37, which I'm not going to read, but you can see it. It's on the notes when I send out. Ezekiel explains that, of course, Ezekiel's in exile in Babylon, so both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah are both having been desolated at this point. And he's talking about a point in time when God's going to bring his people back into the land, and they're going to be one people. And he uses a term to refer to them as a stick or branch. And he says these two sticks are going to become one. So when we talk about the end times, it would be strange to think that this idea that Israel's been gathered back into the land, and yet they're two people rather than one, seems contrary potentially to what Ezekiel is saying. And I think that is challenging, alongside the idea that we would have Israel and the church both as good and God's people, in contrast to the world and the unsaved, and yet God has two separate groups of people that are testifying separately, rather than what passages in the New Testament seem to indicate, including in Romans chapter 11, that the Gentile followers of Christ and the Jewish people in God through Christ are together in the covenant with Israel that Christ has established. So again, that separateness is difficult, I think, or has some challenges to it. We then looked last week at the 4 different terms that are used in Revelation 11 to describe the 2 witnesses for information about what that means about individuals or groups of people. We saw that the Bible does use the term trees or olive trees or trees in general as a metaphor for people, both to speak of groups or individuals. And so we would have to decide how to understand whether Revelation is indicating groups or individuals. Which case is it? It's not just that the Bible only offers one, and that must therefore be what Revelation means. But when speaking of God's people versus the rest of the world, or in contrast to those who are not parts of God's people, the Bible only provides instances of one tree. If God's people are a tree, Romans 11 and Jeremiah 11 only indicate the existence of one tree, not 2. So that, again, I think causes challenges to suppose that the 2 olive trees are representative of 2 groups of people, both of which are of God's people. We talked about the term witnesses, and this is where I want to hover a little bit. The term witnesses in the New Testament, you can go look up the word that's used there, the specific noun word that's used in Revelation 11, and you can do a survey of this. I think there's only 34 times that this word is used in the Greek in the New Testament. You could expand your survey to get other Greek words that are related to it, but if you just look at the noun for the personal noun for a witness, we can come to some sort of informed point of view on how the authors of the New Testament use that term, and that we want to keep that in mind when we look at how John is using this term in the book of Revelation. And so in Revelation 1 verse 5 and Revelation 3 verse 14, Jesus is the faithful witness. So there's witness as a reference to an individual. In Revelation chapter 2 verse 13, Jesus in one of the letters to the churches refers to a man named Antipas, who is a faithful witness as an individual. Deuteronomy chapter 17:6, and then Hebrews, referencing this in the New Testament in chapter 10 verse 28, talk about where this whole concept of 2 witnesses comes from, originating in the law of Moses, whereby they could only put someone to death at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And that is a clear reference to individuals, 2 or 3 individuals who witnessed a sinful act. And so it's not groups as this term originates in Scripture. And so any idea that witness is applied as a reference to a group of people would have to be an elaboration that we would have to see, well, where does the Bible ever elaborate the term witness to refer to a group rather than to an individual? In Matthew 18 and 2 Corinthians 13 and 1 Timothy 5:19, the New Testament employs this concept from Deuteronomy to talk about individuals. We mentioned this last week, Luke 24:48, Acts 1, a couple other places in Acts identify the apostles as witnesses. They are Jesus' witnesses. They are not Jesus' witness. They are individuals, apostles, witnesses. Each one of them is a witness. In Acts 1:22, for example, as they discuss the replacement of Judas, they need a witness to replace Judas. Again, singular individual. Acts 22:15 and 26:16, Paul is referred to as a witness. He's being called to be a witness. In Acts 22:20, Stephen, who died, is identified as a witness. And 1 Peter 5, Peter identifies himself as a witness. So where do we find the biblical use of witness as a reference to a group rather than to an individual? And I would say that it's pretty clear that the New Testament never uses witness to refer to a group. It always uses witness to refer to an individual. And that makes it pretty difficult, I think, to suppose that Revelation is using this term in a novel way. If you want to accept that it refers to a group, then you have to also understand what that means is that you're taking that word in a different way than it has been applied, and you have to have reasons for why you're doing that. On the word candlesticks, we talked about how candlestick is used in both to speak of individuals and to represent groups in the Bible. There's no doubt about that, including in the New Testament, where Jesus says in Matthew 5:14-16, he's talking about your light and putting your light on a candlestick. And he's using the singular you are a light. And so that again would support this idea of individuals as candlesticks, which I said is elsewhere sort of articulated. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. So we will look at Zechariah 4 tonight, because it is another place where we have a reference to olive trees and candlestick that we'll want to talk about. And then the last term, which I think is just as important, which people don't often consider with these other ones, is the application of the term prophet to the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11. These are these two prophets, it says. So in the Bible, the term prophet is never used to describe a group. It's always used to describe an individual. Now, that's not to say that you can't have groups or a group of prophets, but you would never refer to a group of prophets as a prophet. Everybody understand that? That's what we're saying. It's not that groups of people can't bear witness, but a group of people bearing witness are witnesses, not a witness. They are not, a group of people is not a witness. It's a group of witnesses. And that's important to understand how the Bible uses these terms, because it kind of informs us where we're maybe breaking from scriptural information and we would need a good reason to do that. Scripture uses days to speak of either actual days or years, and it also uses the idea of groups of years in the category of 7 years being a week of years. And so we need to understand in Revelation, we'll get into the chronology section on this a little bit more in a week ahead, but are the two witnesses dead for 3.5 days or 3.5 years? It has implications for whether we're talking about groups or individuals. You could imagine that a group of people might die over a 3.5-year period. It's harder, but not impossible, to think of a large group of people dying or being dead for a 3.5, like all at once together at the same time for a 3.5-day period. Not impossible, but it again is challenging. Now, on the other hand, I think you can imagine two individual humans who are prophesying for a period of 1,260 days, as Revelation indicates, and then they're killed at the end of that period, which Revelation states, and then they're dead for 3.5 days. Well, it would be very strange, and it would be harder, in my opinion, to understand Revelation using 1,260 days to refer to actual days, and then using the word day right after that, in that context, in that chronology, to suddenly mean 3.5 years. Why would it do that? If 1,260 days is equivalent to 3.5 years, and then they die, why would you switch now to 3.5 days? We'll just say another 1,260 days, or start with they're going to prophesy for 3.5 years, and then end with they're going to be dead for 3.5 years. So it again, contrary to the natural use of language there, even within prophecy, there's consistency. Otherwise, it's difficult to understand what things mean at all. So with that in mind, let's spend some time in the book of Zechariah. And this passage, I think we've kind of been holding off on because it's somewhat important. It is the formation of the foundational passage that Revelation 11's imagery of in terms of olive tree and candlestick are referring to. And there's reasons that this passage is connected by almost everyone who's looking at this topic with these questions to the book of Revelation. And so I want to read through Zechariah, and I don't want to just read chapter 11 where we have a discussion of the two witnesses. I want to start in chapter 3, verse 8, which is right before that. It's not separate. It's a separate vision that the prophet has, but they're right next to each other in the book. And there are some parallels or connections between these passages that we want to keep in mind. So let's start in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8 to save some time. This is a prophetic passage about that mentions the high priest Joshua. Now, Joshua is the high priest when they returned from exile in Babylon. And so it says here, hear, O Joshua, the high priest, you and your fellows that sit with you, They are men who are wondered at, for behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch. Verse 9, for behold, the stone that I have laid before Joshua, upon that one stone will be 7 eyes. And so that's the main thing I want to get out of this. This chapter doesn't really proceed too much further before suddenly we're into chapter 4, where we're talking about, we're going to see the 2 olive trees and the candlestick imagery appear. But here, notice that the word translated as stone is the lexical number 068. The reason I point that out is it shows up in chapter 4. So let's start with chapter 4, verse 1, where here Zechariah sees this vision, and he says in verse 2, behold, a candlestick of gold with a bowl on the top, and it had 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps. In another part of the study, we're going to dissect the difference between this passage where there's one candlestick, very much a Jewish menorah that was part of the temple inner furniture, where they had this gold candlestick. It was a candelabra, more specifically, where it was a tree candle, as the sort of means, where it's got one base and main trunk, and then it branches out into 7 other branches where each of those have a candle or a lamp on top of it. And we'll talk more about this in Revelation, because in Revelation 11 there's 2 candlesticks and 2 olive trees, but here there are 2 olive trees and 1 candlestick with 7 lamps on it. So in Revelation chapter 11, we have to ask, are the 2 candlesticks there each in a menorah? That would be kind of interesting. It would be new, a different idea. So then he explains in verse 3, there are 2 olive trees on either side of this menorah candlestick. And in verse 4, Zechariah says, I spoke to the angel that talked with me, and I said, what are these? And the angel that talked with me answered and said to me, do you not know what these are? And he said, no, I don't, my Lord. And he said to me, this is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel. So the angel doesn't immediately answer Zechariah's question about the olive trees and the candlestick. And then instead he makes a statement about this individual known as Zerubbabel. Now Zerubbabel was the main leadership partner to Joshua at the time of the return from exile. Joshua was the high priest from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. Zerubbabel was the rightful leading descendant of David and the line of Judah, the kings that were promised to David in the Old Testament. So you have these 2 important figures here. And it says here, this is the word to Zerubbabel, who art thou, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel thou shalt become a plain, and I think Zerubbabel will bring forth the headstone. Now I've again put the strong number after it, the lexical number 068. It's the same number that's used in Zechariah 3 verse 8, that we see Joshua with the stone, and the 7 eyes are upon that stone. Here is a reference now to using the same word, and then it says, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. So now it's talking about the rebuilding of the temple that occurred after the Babylonian exile. It says, his hands will also finish it, and thou will know that the Lord has sent me unto you. And it says that, who has despised the day of small things? For they will rejoice, and they will see the plummet. Here it's translated as plummet. It's the same word, it's stone. When they see the stone in the hand of Zerubbabel, those 7. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that you could easily, the King James isn't very helpful, but what it really is saying, the 7 will see the stone in the hand of Zerubbabel. The 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which go to and fro throughout the earth. So now we can see that both chapter 3 and chapter 4 are talking about 7 eyes which look at the stone that is the foundation stone of the temple restructuring and rebuilding that's occurring under the leadership of Joshua and Zerubbabel, which is historically true. We know this from other sources, including other biblical sources like Nehemiah and Ezra. And then after that, we return to the imagery of the vision in chapter 4, verse 11, where it says, Zechariah says, then I said unto the angel, what are the 2 olive trees on the right side of the candlestick? and on the left side of the candlestick? And I answered and said unto him, what are these two olive branches through which the two golden pipes empty the oil out of themselves? And so we'll talk about the structure of what's going on here with the emptying of oil in a later week ahead when we look at this more particularly, because there's something being indicated with the 7 eyes here. But what we see is that the olive trees, so olive oil is what they use to press oil from the olives to light the candles, so of the menorah. So these trees are supplying oil that is being used to light the candles on the menorah, or the lamps on the menorah candlestick. And it says, I answered, what are these? And he answered to me and said, do you not know what these are? And he said, no, my Lord, I do not know. And then he said, these are the 2 anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth. So there's one candlestick with 7 lamps on it. There are 2 olive trees. So the 2 anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth are here a reference to the 2 olive trees. And we have to ask, who are the 2 olive trees, and who does Zechariah understand them to be? Who is this passage trying to associate them with? And as we evaluate this, there's some important factors to sort of think about with regard to the sets of images here. So let's talk about a few of them. First of all, Zerubbabel and Joshua are leading the effort to rebuild the temple. Let me show you guys some quotes from other biblical sources, just so that we can see this. There are reference to this in Nehemiah and Ezra, but if you look this up in Smith's Bible Dictionary, for example, it says, in Babylon, those who returned with the first caravan of exiles, that is from Babylon, were under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. So these 2 men are prominently known and identified in Scripture and by other historians and biblical scholars. So Joshua was the high priest associated with Zerubbabel in building the temple. That's from Columbia Encyclopedia Britannica. Talks about the visions of Zechariah about Joshua the high priest, and how the 5th vision, which is the one we're just reading in chapter 4, is of the golden lampstand or a candlestick, and the use of the olive tree to emphasize the important positions of Joshua and Zerubbabel, which the 2 figures symbolize. Many of the early Christians thought that the 2 witnesses were historical figures like Enoch and Elijah. We mentioned that, and this has to do with the idea of God's people being led at particular times by groups of 2, and then they mention through the list of this Joshua and Zerubbabel. There's other examples, Moses and Aaron, Caleb and Joshua, that people might mention. Here is sort of a speculative listing, but in any case, just showing that Joshua and Zerubbabel are a pair of 2 that are here appearing in the vision of Zechariah, a vision that describes the 2 olive trees. So when we say, well, how should we understand the 2 olive tree reference in Revelation chapter 11, how that reference, that imagery is introduced and originates in Zechariah is important to us. It forms the precedent. Most people know that. I don't think there's a whole lot of controversy about that point. But if we go back to Zechariah and we say, okay, what does that tell us? We ask the larger question, is it possible that the 2 olive trees in Zechariah are 2 groups of people? I think we're going to start to see some challenges to that, or some additional difficulties that, again, don't conclusively rule that out, but you would then have to explain why you're accepting the idea of groups or how that works with Zechariah. So think about this. If Jeremiah 11, which we looked at a couple weeks ago, is an indicator that the olive trees are, that there's an olive tree representing the house of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and that there is, again, speculatively inferred another olive tree that is referring to the house of Israel, then if that's how Jeremiah was understood, and Jeremiah is writing 50 to 70 years before this, maybe more, how is it that Zechariah, the prophet, does not know that olive trees, the 2 olive trees, are references to the house of Israel and the house of Judah? Wouldn't that have been an established thing? That's what we're sort of supposing in the suggestion that Jeremiah 11 gives us the basis for suggesting that the two olive trees of Revelation are groups of people, is that that's what Jeremiah was understood to mean, or should have been understood to mean. And yet in the next generation, the very one that is fulfilling some of the prophecies that Jeremiah lays out or is given, they do not see or understand that the two olive trees are being discussed in Jeremiah, which means that either they're mistaken or not following correctly. You could maybe argue that because the angel seems to think, well, hey, Zechariah, why don't you understand who the olive trees are? But you could also take it that Zechariah is a prophet. He's got the Holy Spirit. How is he not understanding that this has already been revealed? It does sort of pose a problem. It's not what you would expect. I think if Jeremiah was providing the once and for all clear point of view where God's saying, here, an olive tree is equivalent to the house of Judah, and by inference, the house of Israel is another olive tree. When this happens, it wouldn't seem to be so far-fetched for Zechariah to be like, I don't know, I have no idea what this is. What are these? And so to me, that's unexpected. I think it shows, it kind of throws, for my mind, question on whether or not Jeremiah really ought to be or was ever intended or understood as a reference to two groups of people. Especially because after the exile, that would have been difficult because they came back together as one nation, not as two separate kingdoms. You don't read in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra and afterward about the house of Israel and the house of Judah as separate peoples or separate groups anymore, just as Ezekiel seems to indicate would be the case. So, that's contrary, I think, to expectation if Jeremiah is intended to lay out two olive trees as representative of the house of Israel and Judah. If that's the case, we could still consider whether this might have been two other groups of people, but I think that's going to be an even more difficult. Now you're suggesting something even more novel, that it's not the house of Israel and Judah, but now what is this a reference to? It's probably not a reference to Israel and the church, right? That if your theology lays out that kind of distinction of two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, this is in a period which is Jewish still, and so you're not going to be able to have one be Israel and one be the church, or Jews and Gentiles. This is seemingly applied in the passage to real events in that time going on, and real figures at that time. What is the key, or one of the key things that we said is in both Zechariah 3 and Zechariah 11? What do both these passages seem to have in common? Something going on here that's of interest. I kind of pointed it out earlier. Hopefully you guys are remembering and thinking about that. But both passages, although there's other stuff going on, they both include the stone that is going to be used to rebuild the temple, the cornerstone or foundation stone that is important in this work. And there's two individuals, no one else, two individuals, the two leaders of God's people at that time, who are associated with the important common thread of these two visions, which is inclusive of the rebuilding of the temple. So that's an important connection for us to Revelation chapter 11. The rebuilding of the temple, there's a reference to the 7 eyes, which we'll talk about because there's a further connection there. And then two individuals, not groups, but individuals mentioned here. We don't have references to house of Israel, house of Judah. We have two individuals, Zerubbabel and Zechariah, who are leading the people in the effort to rebuild the temple. And that's what this passage, one of the main things about this passage is about that effort to rebuild the temple under the leadership of these two men. And it's in that context that we get the discussion of the two olive trees and this candlestick imagery that is here, just one candlestick with 7 lamps on it. So when we turn to the book of Revelation, and we start to think about some of these comparisons, let me open up Revelation chapter 11 here. There's something that should be immediately apparent. What is the chapter of Revelation, chapter 11, that introduces the two witnesses in verse 3, starts out with something that is relatable to the subject matter in Zechariah 3 and 4. What is that? I read verse 1 and verse 2. There was given to me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood and said to me, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. But the court that is outside of the temple house itself, leave that court out and do not measure it, for it is given to the Gentiles. And the holy city they will tread underfoot for 42 months. So is there something here that seems to be similar to Zechariah 3 and 4, or at least could be relatable? Give you guys a second here to sort of think about.
It's related to the building of the temple, right?
Yeah, there's certainly at very least references to the temple. In Zechariah 3 and 4, there's this discussion of the foundation stone that was being sort of the beginning of the reconstruction that was happening under Zerubbabel and under Zerubbabel and Joshua, as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah chronicle for us. And here there's just this depiction of the measuring of the temple, and so that may be kind of odd for us, as there is in both cases there was a period where there was no temple, and then there was a reconstruction of the temple. Right now, there is no temple, and some point prior to the end of the age, there's going to be a temple. And in order to build something, you typically have to survey or measure the area, measure the building, and consider those things. And there is prophetic precedent for this that we would find in the book of Ezekiel. And I'm just going to give you some verse reference numbers to that effect. But in Ezekiel chapter 40 and 41 and onward, there is this similar event in which Ezekiel and an angel that is with him, the angel is going about, and they have this reed that they're using to measure the different aspects and structure of the temple, the porch, the gates, the walls, the courts, and the house of the temple itself. And so what Ezekiel is showing is that the temple is or will be rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, which it was under Nehemiah and Ezra, as it's recorded in their books, under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua in particular. And so the measuring of the temple and the signification of a temple having been built and being in existence is common between Revelation 11 and Zechariah, both Zechariah 4 and Zechariah 3. So when people read through those chapters, they sometimes are interested in the two olive trees and the candlestick imagery. They don't necessarily read chapter 3 in association with this question, and they probably don't pay a whole lot of attention to this word that appears as stone, headstone, or plummet. And the seven eyes remains sort of an obscurity that isn't really entering into our attempt to answer this, but it's very much relevant to both books. And so far, we can see why scholars look back to Zechariah to try to understand the imagery of Revelation chapter 11 because of these parallels, the most obvious being the two olive trees, the candlestick imagery, and then also I think we need to keep in mind the temple reconstruction. But if that is the case, and certainly these passages are relevant to each other, then I think we have to ask, is it possible in Zechariah that the two witnesses are understood as groups? And I've given you guys some reasons why, for me, that is tough to accept. And it seems more likely that what's going on here is that these visions right next to each other, having in common the building of the temple, are discussing two individuals, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and that's what the two olive trees are representing, as the two individuals who are leading the way towards the reconstruction of the temple, which the menorah, the candlestick there, is sort of a central representation of temple activity. So these two guys, these two olive trees, are leading the way to get temple activity back underway. Enoch, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to add with the, these two temples. So the two olive trees at this stage of it would have been Zerubbabel and Joshua. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. What's that? At that point.
To piggyback on that, I'm just thinking about another. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I think I'm interrupting you, so I'm going to just pause and let you go.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say one other verse that reminds me of this. This whole concept of Joshua and Zerubbabel standing before God or whatever. isn't there another passage where Joshua is standing before Yahweh and debating the body of Moses or something, and at some point he's in some sort of vision or something. It appears that he's in the Holy Temple because he's being and when the devil's debating over the bodies of Moses, and something happens, and then they give Joshua a new head wrap or something like that. I'm remembering a passage where this Joshua, and I'm assuming it's this Joshua, or it could be Joshua from the Exodus. I'm not sure.
No, you're correct. I think you've mixed in a statement from the New Testament, from I think the book of Jude, about the Michael arguing with the devil about the body of Moses. That's nowhere here. But in Zechariah, if we would have read the first 8 verses, we would have seen that content that you're referencing now. We started, I think, in verse 9.
Yeah.
But yes, that's the case there, that the devil is accusing Joshua and before the angel of the Lord, which is what you were talking about, So the idea that Joshua is given charge over the house and the judgment of the house is all presented there, which is certainly relevant to what's going on in Revelation. We're going to have a lot more to say about that when we discuss the first 2 verses of Revelation 11 and why that is pinned and pressed right into the part here introducing the 2 witnesses, why that's been organized that way, potentially in the book of Revelation. We'll come back to some of the points here in Zechariah for sure. So, John, were you going to say anything, or were you just letting us know that we were missing some of Enoch?
Yeah, I was just letting Enoch know that we could hear him.
Gotcha.
Also, in the examples where there are where you have Aaron and Moses and they're performing these miracles and stuff, it's interesting that if you take those passages in the book of Revelation as being, instead of 2 people, groups of people, then you have to magnify all those other things as well, right? It just kind of was an interesting comparison in terms of,
Yeah, no, I think that's, as I said earlier, and I think we'll talk more about this in a second. We start talking about, okay, these are probably individuals. Are these historical figures? Are they last generation figures? But yeah, if you say, okay, well, look, Moses and Aaron are in Egypt, bringing the people out of Egypt. Again, there's some things to be discussed there with Revelation in chapters 11 and 12, but they're doing plagues. The plagues that Moses performed are discussed or referenced in Revelation 11. Is it, if we have these 2 options, we have large groups of God's people performing, 2 groups of God's people performing plagues, or 2 individuals performing plagues. The scriptural precedent, the clear precedent scripturally, is that this is an indicator of 2 individuals leading God's people, single group of God's people being led under two leaders who are bringing plagues on those who would oppose them, not 2 groups of people conducting plagues. And if you have both options, it's not that the group's option is completely off the table, but you have to have reasons why you would go with that one when there is no apparent scriptural precedent or indicator of it, especially when you're having trouble identifying the groups and other factors. So were you going to follow up on that, John?
No, it was just the pattern, like the pattern.
Yeah.
Just showing the pattern that we see.
Yeah.
Is there any significance with the placing of the stone in terms of location, like identifying the location? Because I guess when you place that first stone, right, that's a pretty important stone to be placed.
Yeah, and the foundation stone, depending on if they're talking about the foundation stone for the altar or for the house. So the altar, where what we commonly think of the altar is we think about the animal sacrifice altar. That's how we think of altars in the priestly setting of the Old Testament. It's not the only altar that was involved in the temple structure. There were, in fact, 3 things that would be called an altar that were in relation to that structure. And sometimes we read in Revelation chapter 11, to pull this up again, and you see the statement about measuring the temple, the altar, and the worship, and those that worship therein. We're tempted to think that this is a reference to the whole larger temple structure, all of it, the courts, the walls, the colonnades, the house, everything. And then the altar of sacrifice, the animal altar, which was in the court of the priests, right? So we at least have a court of the priests, which is the courtyard, the yard right next to the small house. And then outside of that, there was another court, including the court of the Gentiles, which was the outermost court. And so, people read through this verse, this part of Revelation chapter 11, and they think about the larger temple structure with all of the sets of courts and the animal altar of sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what's going on in Revelation, I don't think. And if we follow the language, it's pretty clear. That first and foremost, the word for temple that's used here in the Greek is a very specific word of two words that are used in the New Testament to refer to the temple structure of the Jewish people. They had this specific word naos, which was used for the house itself, just the house, just the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And then they had the word hieron, which is the word for the entire structure, including the courts and the things that were in those subsequent courts. So if you notice here, Revelation 11 specifies that they're going to measure the house itself and the altar and those that worship in the house. So this is confusing for people because we think of the animal sacrifice altar, that brazen altar as it's called, that was in the court of the priests. It was not in the house, it was in the court, the inner court. But there was an altar in the house, and that is the incense altar, the golden incense altar. It's called by that name in the Old Testament. So this verse 1 is specifying just the house, not the courts, and the things that are inside the house. The altar that was inside the house is the incense altar, which is referenced in some ways in Revelation in several places, but there is no reference to the animal sacrifice altar. In fact, verse 2 specifies not. So if we sometimes think about the court of the priests as the inner court, and then the outer court is the court of the Gentiles. So when we read through Revelation 11:2, we think it says the court that is outside of the temple, leave out. Or we might translate this, and some people have, as the outer court of the temple, don't include that in the measurement, in the restructuring, the rebuilding. That's not really as fair to the Greek. The Greek says the things that are to be measured are the house and the things inside the house, but the court that is outside of the house. So all of the courts were outside of the house, including the court of the priests. It was not in the house. It was part of the larger temple structure, but it was not the house. And so this is the Greek word for the house. Now think about this. If you go back to the oldest part of the Old Testament, when they built the tabernacle first, it was the Holy of Holies and the holy place, which were in the tent. And then outside of the tent was the sort of court area of the priest. But there was no court of the Gentiles. There was no secondary court in the original concept. So here we have, again, just the segmentation into two parts, the house and to the things that are outside of the house. And it's saying that the things that are outside of the house, the courts that are outside or surrounding the house, including the court of the priests, are not to be constructed as a part of this final build. They're not measured. They don't exist in the years before Christ comes back. And so that is kind of an important feature. And then if you get back to John's question about the stone, you can say, okay, so when they got back from Babylon, one of the things they did was they first set up an altar that would be necessary to help purify things that they were going to put into place and use in the temple after the Babylonian exile. And so they might have had a stone that they would use for that altar. There would also have been a stone for the house itself, which seems to be what Zechariah is interested in, right? He's talking about the house of the Lord in chapter 3, etc. So there is sort of this idea that some prophet or someone with direction from God or prophetic leading would need to identify the location where this was going to occur, especially after so much time where the building has been destroyed and not in existence, where we need to get someone to point out the right direction to where this is at. That's important as well. And I think in this case, it will be the house itself not the brazen altar, because that doesn't appear to have been part of it. And I will argue, we'll talk about this at some point down the road in the study, that there is no animal sacrifice altar. There is no court of the priest. There's no need for Levitical priestly sacrifice under the Aaronic priesthood. And there is no animal sacrifice going on at this time. That this temple is a temple which only includes activities that occurred inside the temple building itself, which included the lighting of the menorah candles, or the maintaining of the menorah candle, the eating of the showbread, or the displaying of the priestly bread, and the incense altar. Those are the only things that I think are happening. It would only be possible to do those things if you don't have the court of the priests or the brazen altar. There's only one altar mentioned here. We have to decide which one is it. There's two altars that were part of the temple structure and courts. The incense altar inside the house, and the brazen altar of sacrifice in the courtyard of the priests. Here we have to pick which one it is, and I think that the implications for me from the way this is laid out are it's the incense altar. There's no mention of the other one. So I think that helps answer John's question, at least as it pertains to the end time scenario. In the time of Zechariah and Zerubbabel and Joshua, they certainly would have had a stone for both the altar and the house. But we're saying, well, what is Revelation going to be talking about? Okay, good question. I diverged on that. So let me see if there's anything else I missed. I do want to point out, just for future reference, because this will be where we start to get into this next week. You know what? Let's move forward. We'll come back to the seven eyes. That's going to be an important feature. So now that I think we spent a lot of time on whether the two witnesses are groups, and I think we've shown at least why I think it's less reasonable, it's more potentially problematic, has less scriptural base to suppose that the two witnesses are groups and not individuals. That the more reasonable, the more biblically supported idea is that these are individuals. Let's ask the question: are they going to be people from the biblical past, historical past, known biblical figures who have returned, or are they going to be just last generation people who live and fulfill this function? And here there has been a tradition of Christians trying to identify two historical biblical figures, whether it would be Enoch and Elijah, Moses and Elijah, or some others. And there's a couple of other versions of this, but those are the two most popular. And I want to just kind of look at this for a second. My point of view is that these are people from the last generation. They're not biblical figures returned. You have to ask, what biblical indication is there that these are figures from the past that have returned, right? Is it because of the use of the terminology that we find in Zechariah that are also present in Revelation 11 to identify them? If that's the case, then you would have to suppose that maybe Joshua and Zerubbabel have returned, because they were the apparent preeminent figures in Zechariah, where the language originates of this imagery about olive trees and candlesticks. If not, if you're willing to suppose that it's a transferable role that's been two people in it at different generations, and then you suppose, well, maybe it's Moses and Elijah, or Enoch and Elijah, then you've allowed that the term two witnesses or two candlesticks, even by extension, can be fulfilled to different people in different generations. And if that's the case, then why wouldn't there just be two people from the final generation that are in this role? Maybe God has some other purpose, that he's bringing someone back from the past. Some people have cited a passage in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, which states that all men are appointed to die once and then be judged. But, so the idea is, well, Enoch, the figure from before the flood, Enoch did not die, as is recorded in the scripture. He just is taken up to the heavenly city. And we'll talk more about that later. He's taken up to heaven. And that Elijah likewise seems to be escorted up to the heavens through a chariot of some kind. And so it's thought, well, these guys still have to die because all men have to die. I don't think Hebrews is, as others have said, I don't think Hebrews is indicating in chapter 9 that all men must die once. It's indicating that men don't generally die twice, or that you don't die and then come back and get judged and then come back and then get judged. There's just live your life right. You're going to die and then be judged. But not all men die, right? Not all men are going to die. and some men have died twice on a few rare occasions. So can we think of any of those instances? Can we think of instances, is it true that some men have died twice?
Sure, we didn't start
Yes,
fighting.
Lazarus.
Lazarus is a great example from Lou. Lazarus in the New Testament, he dies twice. Enoch, did you have one?
Well, I guess I would argue, I would say also
In the same way.
boy, oh, the
Go
boy
ahead.
that Paul raised from the dead, the boy that Elijah raised from the dead. I mean, essentially everyone who has been raised from the dead.
There's been more than a couple. Even the New Testament reports that this was something that they were able to do. There's several reported in the New Testament. Jesus does a couple. There's a couple in the Old Testament. So not all men die only once. Can anybody think of instances where, besides Enoch and Elijah, that would indicate that it's more than just those two who don't die? There's going to be men who don't die. There's definite New Testament information on this.
All the Christians who were there at the last day, they were caught up.
Yeah, you're right. There's a group of people who are alive and remain alive when Jesus returns. They don't all die. That's God's intent, is to save some alive of his people. They don't all get massacred and killed. So yeah, 1 Thessalonians 4:15 and 17, 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52 all indicate that there's some portion of Christians who don't die. So it's really hard to take Hebrews as an attest that Hebrews was intended by the author and by God to mean, hey, by the way, Elijah and Enoch didn't die, and they're going to come back at some point, which you later find out about the two witnesses in Revelation. Certainly Hebrews doesn't talk about them. That's the intention of this, I think, is harder to accept as the most reasonable point of view.
Can you explain, Scott, maybe what the scripture means by coming back in the spirit of a certain person, such as, Jesus
Right.
talking, John the Baptist came back in the spirit of Elijah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so let's do that next. This will be, I've got this section on this, but we do have these examples with, let's talk about Elijah, because Elijah figures into both of these common sets, whether it's Elijah and Enoch or Elijah and Moses. We have the Old Testament verses in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1 and chapter 4, verse 5, where it indicates, let's just go read these real quick. Malachi 3:1 and 4:5. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Now, Jesus didn't suddenly come to his temple necessarily during his first advent, right? But even the messenger of the covenant by whom you delight, and behold, he will come. And then it says in verse 2, who will abide the day of his coming? Who will stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, right? And so this has an end times context, it seems, right? The day of his coming, there's this destructive potential refining here. If we go to chapter 4, see a similar idea. Like when Jesus comes back, he's coming to his temple pretty quick. In the New Testament, he's out ministering. He travels around, comes to Jerusalem, goes away, comes back. He doesn't come in judgment. Verse 4, or chapter 4, verse 1, behold, the day that he comes, it burns as an oven, when the Lord will burn them up, the Lord of hosts, right? This is sort of an end time destructive judgment figuring, and it says, this is important, verse 4, remember the law of Moses, my servant. And then verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So again, end times contexts, mention of both Moses and Elijah here. Both Moses and Elijah's miracles are referenced, or plagues are referenced in Revelation 11, the turning of the water to blood and the preventing rain from coming. And then we have, just to do the Moses and Elijah part, this transfiguration of Christ in the Gospels, where Jesus goes up to a high mountain, he's transfigured and becomes glorious and white and bright and shining, and with him are Moses and Elijah. And so some people are like, oh, this is a foreshadowing of the Moses and Elijah coming back. But if we look at Elijah as the sort of helpful example here, there was this expectation among the Jewish people that Elijah would come before the Messiah, And so you see them asking about this in the Gospels. When John the Baptist is coming around, they're saying, hey, are you Elijah? And the disciples end up asking Jesus, isn't Elijah supposed to come? They say that Elijah is supposed to come. And Jesus' response to that is, yeah, Elijah is supposed to come, and he has come. And then it says that the disciples understood that he was talking about John the Baptist. And if that's the case, and certainly, here we have them applying this expectation that seems to come from places like Malachi, which was originally, I think, in an end time setting, to even foreshadowing his first coming, then what does that precedent tell us? Well, John the Baptist was not Elijah returned. He was, as Luke chapter 1, verse 17, the angel Gabriel, having told John the Baptist's father, you're going to have a son. Then John the Baptist's father comes out and he says, look, my son's going to, I think it's Gabriel that says this, he's going to go forth in the spirit and power of Elijah. Well, he did. He was a man like unto Elijah in many ways, not in all ways. He wasn't out there causing drought and doing some of the other things that Elijah did, but he is a fulfillment of this expectation. And what it teaches us is that you're not looking, even when the Bible invokes a particular figure as a reference point for a prophetic event, it doesn't mean that that actual figure is going to be the one who is accomplishing it in the final prophetic fulfillment in the end times in particular. It will be a contemporary generation person like John the Baptist was, who is mirroring the role or some aspect of the role of this the named predecessor. So if that's the case, and we can say, well, look, the Bible in Revelation is using several reference points to different generations and different prophetic predecessors, it's not going to be one of those guys or two of those guys, but it's using more than two. You've got Moses, you've got Elijah, you've got Joshua, you've got Zerubbabel, you've got Moses, you've got Aaron. This is not just two people. What it shows is that each of those guys, and particularly those pairings where we have the pairs of them, are showing different generations with different men from those generations fulfilling a role related to bringing God's people into the kingdom, the construction of the temple and tabernacle, the confrontation with those who are holding dominion over the world, and those sorts of activities. And in each case, because the Bible invokes in Revelation each of those different at least six different guys, it doesn't mean to specify any particular two of them, other than to say that, yeah, just as these guys have done this, so there's going to be somebody else that does this in their time. And I think that is pretty informative for us, especially when we look at the example of John the Baptist and Elijah, that must be the case, or we ought to move in that direction in our reasoning to say that that's probably, or at least a very strong contention of what's going on in Revelation as well. Is that getting what you were wanting to talk about?
Yeah,
Okay.
Just a little bit about what their role is, probably that same role that they fulfill, similar to the one that they have before. So, even in the sense like John the Baptist seemed almost dressed like Elijah, even,
Yeah.
in similar aspects. So, but it's yet he had mother and father and all these different things. He was contemporary, but it seems like that pattern could be followed with not to say that the exact spirit is in them, but their same kind of spirit that they had, or the demeanor that the role that they played. That's what it seems to be.
Yeah, and there's even John the Apostle is standing in the place of and depicting. I'll discuss that possibility ahead as well. And each of these kinds of references in Revelation, whether it's to Zechariah and Zerubbabel and Joshua, or Moses or Elijah, or Moses and Aaron, and also to Elijah, all of those things show, again, more reason to think that these are individuals, not groups. That this is two particular individuals, as it always has been, and they're not named because they don't exist when the Bible writes about them. The other thing to ask is if they're, let's just say, practically speaking, if these are historical figures from the biblical period who have come back, what value would that add to their role, right? Two people show up, one says, I'm Moses, and the other one says, I'm Elijah, we've returned. They're old looking guys or something, or one says I'm Enoch and the other says I'm Elijah. we will have no means other than their prophetic work anyway to validate that that's who they are. Their identification of themselves from the past is not necessarily a stronger witness to their own miraculous activities, because the miraculous activities that they're doing and their message is what validates us following them. Not that it also is what validates any claim to be who they would be from the past. So that it's really hard to say. It's not like we go, oh, that looks like the pictures I've seen of Elijah, that must be him. So it doesn't particularly add anything, and unless we're forced scripturally to the conclusion that it must be some returned biblical figure, that there's some added value, that the Bible is explicitly articulating that, we also have this very strong option that this is just people from that generation who are fulfilling a role like these other predecessors have done. So
it was funny when you said it, that they would, recognize the pictures. That it would be kind of funny. It's like, oh my goodness, oh, they're both black. No.
That would throw some people off, I think.
But one of the things I would say, though, is interesting of that is somehow, some way, maybe spiritually and supernaturally or whatever, but Peter and the disciples seemed to recognize Moses and Elijah when they stood next to Jesus hundreds of years after that, and who knows how they were able to do that, but it must have been something supernatural. But it's just interesting how they were able to recognize them, or at least Peter was or something, but maybe they just knew spiritually or something.
Well, that's a great point to bring up. Obviously that event in the Transfiguration is succinctly recorded, right? So we know that Moses and Elijah appear. That's what we're told, that they somehow understood this over the course of those events. We don't know how they know. We might suppose they had some sort of insight, or it was obvious in some way spiritually to them or otherwise. But it's also the case that Jesus is conversing with Moses and Elijah in that period of time, but we don't get any of the recording of what that conversation was. So it's entirely possible that the reasons the apostles knew that this was Moses and Elijah had to do with other things that are not explicitly recorded in the narration that we have, including the conversation between Jesus and these individuals, rather than some ability to just physically recognize these people.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, because it says, okay, so he might have been talking like, hey, Moses, hi, Elijah, how you doing?
Yeah.
And then because Peter's like, okay, let's make tents for them. But yeah, that's interesting. They're discussing something with him that clearly could have been how they identified him. So.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of information about this other than the conclusions that the apostles were able to come to, but we don't know exactly how they came to them. I think we don't want to draw too strong of an inference from silence there. The last thing I'll say before we close on this study for tonight is, if you look through the book of Revelation and you do a study of any period after the letters, right? So the letters are sort of directed to first century churches in Asia Minor, but the part of the vision that really starts to discuss end times, future events, and you look at the different figures that are depicted in that larger section of the end times portion of this vision, it is by and large always, maybe always, the case that any figure discussed is an end times figure, not a historical figure from the biblical past. That's a pretty strong scenario that you can survey this and go, yeah, these are always, whether they're unless they're specifically invoked, like there's a reference to the Song of Moses, you're like, okay, there's Moses. But in general, the vision of Revelation about is talking, when it's talking about the end times, it's talking about end times figures, unless it's making some particular attachment to a person of the past. But then in this case, you'd be arguing that in the unique case, it's talking about biblical figures in the end time setting, which again, it may be possible, but it's not the natural, easiest thing. We've developed a tradition about this. I'm not sure that the tradition itself is valid or sound, but it is not the most natural or biblically available point of view. So I'll stop the study there tonight. I know we're running a little long, and we'll pick up more next week.